Professor, welcome back to the program. We're seeing a lot of stories about housing bubbles and concern that a recession is coming and that it might burst a housing bubble. I remember back in the day, Will Rogers famously said, "My daddy told me, buy land, they ain't making it no more." And, land has and housing has been a fairly reliable investment, a major vehicle for the wealth of the middle class, certainly throughout my lifetime. I'm wondering what causes housing bubbles? Are we in a housing bubble? What happens when they burst? Where are we at with regard to all that? I mean, obviously we saw this disaster in 2008 around housing. Where do you think we're at now?
Well, I'm afraid it looks rather similar. As many people have noted, that's not unique to me, not by a long shot. Bubble is usually something one is very clearly seeing after it's over. In other words, it is a 20/20 hindsight kind of thing. You notice that prices went up a long time, very far in a short period of time, and then they collapse. And you look back on it and you say, oh, there was a bubble, and oh, it burst. This has happened repeatedly, both on a national level and in regions. The most famous part of the United States for having housing bubbles has been Florida, at least for the last century, for all kinds of special reasons. The prices have gone crazy over the last 2 or 3 months. That's very clear. The major reason for that is not the pandemic, and it's not the Ukraine war. It's the fact that for 20 years now, 20 years, the threat of a collapse of our economy, of a real depression, has been so severe that the Federal Reserve, governed whether by a Democrat or a Republican, didn't really matter, was terrified to do anything other than bring interest rates down to or even below zero, and that made money cheap, and that let the borrowers get going to buy the house and the borrowers to get going to make the house if you're a builder. The end result was a boom. And now the question is, with the inflation everywhere, in the housing industry even more, are we going to rein that back in? The Federal Reserve says yes. And then the question immediately comes, oh my goodness, will all the people who have borrowed money to buy a home be unable to make the payments? And then we're exactly where we were in 2007 and 8 all over again.
Yeah, now in 2007, 2008, there were liar loans that were legal, and and you had this whole slicing and dicing into collateralized debt obligations and everything else. I thought a lot of that had been taken care of. Are you concerned about those things, or is this more just that if there's a general downturn, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs, and when they lose their jobs, they won't be able to make their mortgage payments?
Yeah, because, on the one hand, there are some restrictions that people point to who want to comfort themselves, but offsetting that are a whole set of new developments that have to be taken into account. During the pandemic, people, because they had to adjust their lives, borrowed, using the equity in their homes to borrow and jack up their indebtedness in order to improve their home, add a room, make accommodations for working at home, and all of that. Those people have raised their level of debt and didn't have to be governed by some of those adjustments that were made after 2007 and 8. And number two, perhaps more important, is that we have eroded the mass purchasing power and incomes of our people. Let's remember, the mass of Americans just went through the pandemic, which cost them all kinds of expenses, then an economic crash about the same time, now a devastating inflation that is literally making it impossible for them to continue the scale of level of standard of living they had. When you put all that together, you are suggesting the possibility of one of those so-called perfect storms where too many variables come together and make it impossible for the high level of prices. And remember, we have one more thing to keep in mind. The failure of many people along the way to maintain their homes over the last 4 years has meant that we've had a very significant shift in the way we own houses in the United States. Many fewer homes are owned by the people who live in them. Many, many more, we're talking millions now, of homes are owned by investment companies. They look at this the way they look at any other investment. If things go south, if the number of people who can buy in by renting, they're going to dump those houses. And when they do, you're going to see a new kind of depression of the housing bubble that we didn't even see before, because we hadn't gotten to the point where houses become an investment game for the super rich, rather than, as you put it, a way for the middle class to accumulate at least a little wealth.
Yeah, I wrote an op-ed about this about a year ago, and I was shocked doing the research into it, how extraordinary. I mean, in some communities you find, as many as half of all the homes that were available were being bought by, these giant hedge funds and, organizations like BlackRock and whatnot, as I recall. And it's, and then they're jacking up rents on top of that and making housing even more unaffordable. How much of a factor in the current price of housing do you think is this, I don't know if you'd call it market manipulation or just the predictable outcome of, big investors getting into housing for the first time, I think, in American history, at least the way they're doing it now. In Chattanooga, for example, they were talking about some mind-boggling percentage of houses owned by a big, hedge fund. How is that affecting things?
I think it's affecting it very significantly. Even if the number was still small, let's say 10%, 8%, 12%, something around there, you might think of that as small. But remember, a crash has to only start with a few people bailing. Once you start doing that and the prices start going down, it builds on itself. It means everybody else who was on the edge about selling their home is now prompted to sell it quickly because the prices are coming down. You want to sell before the price of what you're selling. And that becomes the very cataclysm that we then look back on and say that the bubble burst. I would like to underscore that the same BlackRock and other investment operations buying up housing in the United States are also doing it elsewhere. I did research recently to discover that one of the major owners of homes in Berlin, Germany, is the same company that owns homes in Chattanooga, New York, California, and all the rest, which means these companies are not just comparing housing in the United States with other housing in the United States. They're global. This is a globalization. If they can't make the kind of money they want in this country, they can do it somewhere else. And they will. They're not going to be bound by some rules of commitment to one society or another. Their business is growing globally, and we're now becoming just another place, and we better show up with the right money, the right profit, or else they're going to leave. And the cataclysm that may come from that, of the declining prices leading your regular homeowner to get out of it quickly too, that they're not responsible for that. They don't have to pay for that. They don't calculate that. They will make their decisions, and we all in this country will be left to live with the consequences.
I know in the developed world, at least the part of the developed world that vigorously embraced neoliberalism back in the 1980s, most of these laws have been done away with. But they're so common around the world, where countries say housing is something that we, it's so essential to the general welfare of our people that we're going to heavily regulate it. And foreign investors may not own housing unless they actually live in it and they have the equivalent of a green card, whatever that may be in that country. And corporations may not own housing except within very, very limited constraints, apartment buildings and things like that. As an economist, is that the sort of thing that you think that would be a good idea here in the United States, to limit, housing to families? Or is that the sort of thing that, I can just hear Stephen Moore's voice in my head going, that's government interference in the free market, oh my God.
Yes, let me make it real clear. I believe in government interference in the free market whenever a rational assessment of the situation indicates that the society as a whole benefits more, and that those are the issues for me. I compare the private profitability of the individual corporation with the social conditions. The craziness of the economics profession, of which I'm a part, to have taught all these years that what is privately profitable by some magic is supposed to automatically be what's best for society. I mean, I understand why they want to sell us that craziness, but we don't have to believe it. No, I agree that things like housing, food, and medical care are things that are fundamental to a decent life and should not be held hostage by people who tell us themselves that profit is their bottom line, that profit is why they're in business, that profit is what they achieve or go for. Okay, you go for profit, but not if it involves my diet, my home, and those other things. That's why, for example, in Europe right now, there are movements for cooperative housing precisely to avoid everything you just.
Great. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you so much, Professor.